I would just wonder if you would mind just introducing yourself. Carolyn, you could start, and then Betsy, and then Connie.
Okay. I'm a photographer, not a performer, and not a public speaker. I have always worked, I'm obviously from Birmingham, Alabama. I have always, my work has always addressed issues of identity, typically kind of marginalized segments of society. This is the most personal project that I've ever done, living in limbo lesbian families in the Deep South.
Hi, I'm Betsy. I started out as a photographer and then moved into film and video. And I've done a number of lesbian-oriented films. I started with Roof, which was a fiction film, and then I did Hearts Cracked Open, about a documentary about lesbian tantric sex. And then I also did Chained, which is a documentary, and I'm working on a feature documentary right now called East LA Interchange, and I have a short film, fiction film, that's going to be on the festival circuit this summer.
Oh, cool.
It's called Click.
Hi, I'm Connie. I'm originally from Germany. I'm a photographer. I live in San Diego for 15 years now. Started like just with general photography, portraits, weddings, and get a little bit more into community and do lesbian, how they actually want to see themselves.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to start by talking with Carolyn. If you haven't seen the exhibit upstairs, it's called Living in Limbo, and it's lesbians and their families in the Deep South, all in Birmingham, Alabama. And so I guess I would just like to ask Carolyn first, what made you want to do this project?
I'll have to say, if you were there last night, I'm sorry you have to hear this again, but I think it's important. I want to tell the story that that inspired this. I have had a friend who, well, first of all, let me just say I'm from Alabama. There's not a single law there to protect the civil rights of the LGBT population, none. A friend of mine was dying of cancer in the hospital with her partner by her side, and her family changed the locks on their home and moved in. So when my friend died, she had to get the police to let her in to get a change of clothes to wear the funeral. And then when we went to the funeral, the heterosexual friends said that they didn't know the couple were gay, even though they'd lived together 20 years, and that they didn't know gay people could be treated that way in Alabama. So that was really a trigger for me. I kind of had an epiphany. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I had a sense that I was going to do something with my work that was also advocacy for my community. So that's sort of how and then, it just sort of, I toyed around with different concepts, how I could do something that was conceptual in a way that respected people's privacy, but was authentic.
You also have some of the, well, let me ask this question. Was it difficult to get people to participate?
Initially, it was very difficult. Initially, I didn't want to photograph myself with my partner. We were all kind of afraid, living in fear, really. Most people in Alabama that I knew were living in a kind of don't ask, don't tell manner. So everybody kind of knew that you were family, but you didn't talk about it, didn't put a name on it.
I do know that some of the participants actually wouldn't face the camera.
Is
that right?
So my concept was you could choose to face the camera or have your back to the camera. People wore what they wanted. I photographed them in the studio just to protect their privacy. And I let people decide what they wanted to do. I mean, I hand-hold my camera, and I put a mark and just said, stay in this general area, and then I just moved around them. And I also delivered in series 3 words and sort of captured their response to the words. One was lesbian, the other was pride, and then finally it was prejudice. And I will tell you, one of the big things that I noticed and that I learned is that the women my age, many of them, particularly in the beginning, would look, when I said lesbian, some would say, I'm really uncomfortable with that word. That makes me, there was a lot of discomfort. And when I said prejudice, there were some that cried. The young people, when I said lesbian, they're like, don't put a label on me. And when I said prejudice, they were like, well, I don't know what you're talking about. Of course, then, one of them's girlfriend would say, yeah, but you remember those guys drove down the road and yelled dyke? I mean, so they had some sense of prejudice, but certainly nothing that my peers had experienced. So, so it's anytime I don't know how it is for y'all, but anytime I've done a documentary project, and I've done several, I learn something and I change because of it. And so the thing that changed the most for me, besides coming out of the closet, that's pretty obvious, but the thing that changed the most is I understood that even in Birmingham, things are changing at 100 miles an hour.
Yeah, I think this is going to make a big change there because of you, and the women in the families in the photos too. I know that you've done other exhibits, and you said you've always done series. And I wanted to know, what other things have you photographed before this?
My very first documentary project was in the 90s, and I photographed people with disabilities. It was a series. Actually, the exhibit was at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, which is where Living in Limbo opened as well. It was during the 90s, which many of you may know, that was the kind of the civil rights movement. That was when things were happening for people with disabilities, legally and socially. So I did that project then, and I'll brag a little bit and say it became a book, and it won first place IPPY for books that for inspiration, and I got an award from Boston University for books that affect social change. So that was my very first project, and then I've also done long-term survivors of HIV, and then teenagers, my favorite. That's been an ongoing thing because my sisters have been kind enough to have a continual supply of teenagers.
I wasn't sure if you were kidding or not when you first said teenagers, which is a favorite.
Yeah.
One of the questions that's been coming up as the exhibit's been here, it's actually been here for a while already, is why shoot them in studio rather than on location in their homes or something like that?
Well, it was really a privacy issue because in the very beginning, I had such a difficult time getting people to participate. In fact, hardly anybody agreed to participate until I met with them. So I just stopped asking. I would just say, can I talk to you about this project? And so there'd be a first meeting just to talk. And then, particularly after I had 2 or 3 that I could show, that was very helpful. People liked that there was the opportunity to have their backs to the camera. More than one person who planned to have their back to the camera ended up facing the camera when they got there. So it was privacy. I didn't want, we didn't know how this would go, how it would be tolerated in the community, so we didn't want to put anybody at risk in terms of identifying where they lived.
Let me think. Another thing that you talked about was some of these families had never had a portrait done.
Yeah, more than one person said they'd never had a family portrait done because they didn't feel comfortable in public acknowledging the nature of their relationship or touching or any of those things. And I let people decide whether to touch or not touch, and everybody touched. Yeah.
And some of the families, some of the couples had been together for decades that had no photo, right?
That's right.
That's amazing.
Yeah. In fact, one of the, and the photograph, if you see the photograph with their backs to the camera, and the little girl has Peeps on her shoulder, on her T-shirt, the reason their backs to the camera is that one of the mothers was fired from her job as a principal because they found out she was gay. So that's their story. But their daughter was about to graduate from high school, and they didn't have a family portrait. And I'll tell you, the people who had their backs to the camera, I also photographed facing the camera for their eyes only. So they got family portraits facing forward.
One of the things I think you all might have in common on the panel is some type of either photographic memory or where you Carolyn, talked about kind of, even as a kid, being able to play a reel or a set of photos back of something you'd experienced.
Yeah, I mean, I remember my father was in the military, and we lived all over the world, just moved a lot. And my memories of my life occur as like visual snapshots. and sometimes, I mean, even on a daily basis, if I am at the mall and I see something happen that's intimate between two people, because that's really what I'm interested in is intimacy, I'll play that back in my head. I mean, the visual experience is so powerful to me that I'll just play it over and over and over and get that kind of rush every time I see it in my mind's eye. And even when I was in college, I would learn biology by making little movies in my head of the process. So.
Betsy, you had mentioned something too about photographic memory.
Yeah, I have a photographic memory. But I think I do the same thing with creating movies. And I think that's actually why I went into doing movies, because I kept seeing all these things over and over in my head. And when you think visually and you're a visual person, it's really, it's challenging in this world, but it's also a really wonderful thing, because when you experience something, you have this wonderful visual image of it, and then, it helps you so much with your art and creation.
And Connie, you had talked to me about it being your main way of expressing yourself even as a kid, right?
Right. Yeah, it's, well, I grew up in East Germany, so all art was pretty much underground anyway. And you couldn't really talk about things because everything was not allowed. So you found like ways how to express like what you're pissed off at what's wrong with the whole thing. So I did a bit of photography. A lot of my friends were playing music or visual art. So we had all this whole underground going on, and it was really, really exciting actually too. Because, you always had these things, you didn't want to get caught also. But I was very young, and it was exciting.
One of the other things, Carolyn, you could start with this, is doing photography as a healing thing for you. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said before, I always learn something and always grow from the experience. And oddly, when I started this, I didn't think about, the fact that I was going to have to come out of the closet. I mean, it's kind of crazy. It sounds crazy, I know, but I was like, well, I'm going to do this about these other people, that are in my community. So the growth for us, and my partner and I have been together 34 years, and we both were living in the closet, and of course she had to come out too. And we just have lived with such authenticity in the last year. It's hard to explain, how much more relaxed you can be when you don't have to worry that somebody's going to hurt you because they know you're gay. I mean, I was on the morning news talking about being a lesbian, so there it is. Everybody knows now, and it was such a relief and a release. And also, it was nice for me to learn about the diversity in our community and how the different, particularly intergenerational groups functioned.
And Betsy, you had talked about that being really true for you too, healing from it.
Yeah, in fact, the reason that I made my feature documentary, Hearts Cracked Open, was to address issues of sexual healing and healing from chronic pain and just homophobia in the lesbian community. I mean, we didn't have anything that really addressed all of those issues and put them in a spiritual context. And so in the process of making this documentary, which, documentaries take forever, it was like 4 years, it just, for me, became this total healing process because I live with chronic illness. And in doing that, my pain started to get better, I started feeling better, and it's just been like this continual growth process.
Connie, did you have any experience with using photography kind of as a healing thing for you?
Well, closure-wise, probably, yeah, a lot of it, but not like, I had not similar experiences. So, yeah.
I wanted to ask Carolyn, you talked about kind of having the African American community, you had to kind of break into that community, and how did that happen?
Well, I will say part of the African American, the reason in Birmingham that it's difficult to access the African American community is that there is such a strong link to the church, and the African American church is very conservative in general. And I know I'm generalizing, but that's in general. I finally got one couple to participate, and it was through a Caucasian couple, a younger couple. So it was a young black couple that I got involved. And then once I had a photograph of them, then if I could bring people up to the studio and say, will you just talk to me? And they would see the photograph, then they would say, you know, that's respectful. And yeah, I want a photograph like that of, you know, my girlfriend and I to hang in the living room, because I gave everybody a print. And so, so that's how I did it. It's just one person at a time.
Did you have other experiences with other projects? And also, this is for the whole panel, have you had struggles with getting people to actually be in your photos or in your films?
Well, I'll just say one thing about that. When I did the project about people with disabilities, every single person that I asked said yes. So it was a completely different experience this time, when I would say, you know, almost none of my friends participated in my project, you know. And I will also say that there are some participants in the audience, so if anybody wants to talk to them, you know, feel free. They're happy to answer any questions if you have questions about what it was like to be on the other side of the camera.
So would either one of you like to speak about?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you have to get your subjects to trust you. So I think, I mean, with both Chained and Hearts Cracked Open, which are documentaries, you just have to let the people know, like, what your intention is and what you're going to do and how respectful you're going to be of their stories and who they are. So I think that it just, I mean, it always takes convincing for people to let themselves be that vulnerable and, you know, just putting themselves in front of other people. So that's what I found.
For me, it's really interesting. It's almost like I live in this little bubble in San Diego now, in Hillcrest, because I have actually so many people, they want to participate, that I have to say, you know, we have to do it next month, I have no time, you know. They're just like all for it.
That's
That is
nice.
true. We do live in California, where there's a lot of people who want to be in front of the camera.
That's a good problem to have, and probably one Carolyn hasn't often experienced. Let me see. One of the things Connie had mentioned was she's worked in different fields, not just as a photographer. And I asked her about her struggles being a lesbian photographer, and she said, I've actually had more struggles as a woman even than just being a lesbian, you know? And so I'd love you to all talk about, maybe address that, and start with Connie.
Yeah, but photography, it's probably even more out there, but also I worked in the IT world, and it's all male-dominated. And like with photography, it's really like, you know, and I have friends, they do it with me. If you do red carpet events, these guys, they just step on you. They push you out of the way because they really want this picture. And it's sometimes frustrating, but you just have to, I don't know, get a little bit harder yourself too, and just, you know, so I guess.
Yeah, I started in, you know, like mainstream film, working my way up, you know, as PA, production coordinator, assistant director, and I loathed it. Like, I just, I mean, some of the guys are cool, but just the upper echelon, like women are, still, it's so frustrating today. The statistics are horrible about women who are directors. So I just decided, you know what, screw this, I'm going to do documentaries and be an activist and do what I want to do and not have to deal with that. So that's been, and so then the biggest struggle is financial. But I don't have to deal with the guys who are jerks anymore.
I would say that being a woman has been an asset to me in my work. I don't know that I've ever felt like it was an issue. Because my work's about intimacy and documentary and being with people and shared humanity, I think being a woman may be an advantage, if anything. And I just do fine art. I don't do commercial work, so that would be a different experience.
One of the things I've experienced working at the archives is anytime a woman donates her history and she says, I was the first woman in this field or the only woman in this field, there's just horror stories to follow after you know, hear that. So it's nice that Carolyn actually had it as an asset, being a woman. We don't hear that very often. Another thing reason I really wanted to do this panel was because I was, I think, telling Connie more than anybody else that women all struggle with a lot of the same things, but we don't always talk to each other about them. And so I was really looking forward to this, where you can all talk about some of the common struggles that you have. Betsy, I'd love you to talk a little bit about your work and what you're doing now.
Oh, okay. I'm working on a feature documentary project that's hopefully for PBS. It's a documentary that looks at Boyle Heights in East LA and its multicultural history in light of the US today. And I'm kind of using it as a microcosm and a role model. And then I also have a film that I produced called Click that will be at festivals, which is a lesbian comedy. So it's back into fiction for me. And I'm also hoping to get a feature, so a lesbian feature going this year.
Great. Connie, I know you've been shooting a lot of lesbian events in the last couple years. Could you talk about what you do?
Well, I try to, especially for the community, work a lot. So a lot of women festivals, which is a lot of fun also, not just work. Yeah, red carpet. So wherever I can help out, and I try to do that.
Did you ever dream when you were a young girl that you would be at Dinah Shore weekend shooting nothing but lesbians all weekend?
No, but it's fantastic.
Shoot, I had one more question. Oh, I know. I was wondering if each of you would take turns, Carolyn maybe first, talking about if you had any mentors, anybody you really followed from the time you were young or maybe in your early 20s or whatever.
I think there were a couple. Judy Dater and Mary Ellen Mark were my two earliest heroes. And then also, oddly, Irving Penn. I liked all of their different styles of portraiture, and I really think, when I look back at my whole body of work, not just what's upstairs, I can certainly tease out influences from each of them. Mary Ellen Mark, what I loved about her work it sort of gave me the idea that you could do documentary portraits. And Tiny, her series Tiny, just never left me. It was so powerful to me. And I've actually taken a couple of workshops with her, so she really meant a lot to me. And I took a workshop with Judy Dater as well, and just that kind of stark, in-your-face portraiture that she did in the 70s. I love that. And then Irving Penn, I can remember the first time I saw his work, just the huge impact and the direct, kind of simple forms and direct gaze. I loved all that. So I would say those are the three that I just fell in love with early on.
I loved Agnes Varda. So growing up, I just thought she was incredible, and the way that she was able to mix, documentary and fiction and experimental and everything. So and then I got to meet her, and I was like in heaven. So that was a big influence. And then when I first graduated from college, I moved to San Francisco, and I worked with Jane Wagner and Tina de Felisantonio there. And that was what gave me the impetus to go into documentary when I saw their work on, they did Girls Like Us, and I was an intern on that and did all of the transcribing and helping with editing, and it was just an amazing project.
Connie, any major influences when you were a kid?
Yeah, a little bit different. For me, it was Bob Dylan. So, so he actually helped me out to get out of East Germany. I mean, it was still after the wall came down, but he actually helped me through a lot of times, hard times. And then later on, since I moved to San Diego, it was Victoria Tischler Blue. She is an old bassist from the Runaways, the first a punk band. And she's a filmmaker and a photographer, and she calls me sometimes and says, what are you doing? Why don't you do this? And so she keeps me on my toes. So she's
I think it's really interesting that you all have met at least one person that you really admired. I mean, that's pretty amazing. A lot of people never do. So that's great. Okay, well, that was wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you. Yeah.